Hello, and welcome to CRPS Contender, my complex regional pain syndrome education channel. Today's video is Disintegrated Connectome, Functional Lesions of the Psyche. This video is part of my Narrow Mind Till the Soul Begins to Break, CRPS, a biopsychosocial developmental disorder series. Before we get into the content of this video, I'm going to do a quick refresher of what CRPS is in case anybody, for any reason, is not quite aware of what I've been talking about on this channel. CRPS is a severe immunoneurological disorder where the innate, adaptive, and neurological arms of the immune systems attack and degrade the entirety of the nervous system, with a focus on the autonomic nervous system, which is consisted of three subsystems. The sympathetic system, which is responsible for your mobilization responses. You feel threatened, you need to get up and get away or fight back. Your parasympathetic system, which is responsible for your maintenance responses, eating, sleeping, recuperating, getting laid. And your enteric system, which is responsible for your gastrointestinal motility responses and making sure you get the nutrition out of your food. All three of these systems, which create the autonomic nervous systems, regulate automatic, involuntary, and unconscious functions and processes. CRPS degrades many areas of the brain with a focus on the limbic system, which is responsible for emotions, motivation, memory, and fear-associated learning, and the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in executive functions, planning, prediction, personality, social behavior, language, and the will to live. They both do other things as well, but those are some of the main functions there. CRPS degrades all types of tissue that exist in the human body: nervous tissue, epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, and connective tissue. With that little refresher out of the way, let's talk about the connectome. The connectome is the comprehensive map of neural projections within the nervous system. This is a wiring diagram of close, semi-distant, and distant synaptic connections. Now remember, synaptic connections are where neurons have their branching dendrites reaching out into the brain, projecting outwards to connect with other neurons. These dendritic arms meet up with other neurons, and in those connections, they're called synapses, and that's where they communicate with each other and send chemical messages to each other. These can be close connections, semi-distant, or distant connections. Neurons can only carry out their functions in coordination with other neurons. Remember, neurons can only do two things. They are on or they are off, and that's it. The function of the brain is only as reliable as the projections, synaptic connections, and neural pathways that are created between the neurons and the strength, density, and usability of those pathways. If neurons cannot communicate with each other, the nervous system cannot carry out its function in a regulated, integrated, and spontaneous way. Spontaneous means it happens of itself. It doesn't need to be controlled. That's what it's supposed to do, and it's going to do it when the time is right. Neuronal communication capacity and the computational power of the brain is completely dependent upon the subtle architecture of complex connectivity between neurons. So now let's discuss when most of these connections occur. During the first decade of life, trillions and trillions of neuronal synapses are created, making the foundational psychological framework from which that individual will operate for the rest of their life. During babyhood and toddlerhood, which is before birth, including the entirety of pregnancy, to about 3 years old, over 1 million connections are created per second, a rate that is never again reached in the entirety of human life. When children detach and dissociate as a stress response to their environment, the connections that should occur during healthy development don't get created, creating functional lesions. Prolonged activation of the stress response system disrupts brain architecture and organ development and increases stress-related disease and cognitive impairment risk for a lifetime. This is known as the ACEs. I'm going to do a whole nother video on that. But if you want to look that up, that is a well-evidenced concept. There is nothing controversial about it. That is what the evidence says. So I'm going to do a whole nother video on that, but if you don't want to wait, go ahead and look that up. Adverse childhood experiences. Toxic stress occurs when a child experiences strong, frequent, and or prolonged adversity, such as physical or emotional abuse, chronic neglect, caregiver addiction or mental illness, exposure to violence, and accumulated burdens of economic hardship without adequate adult support. This is known as attachment theory. Again, I am going to have a whole nother video on this, but if you don't want to wait, very well evidenced and researched, you can look it up. Now, one thing I do want to say about this, toxic stress does not necessarily mean that a parent is unloving or abusive. Okay, now that definitely can be the case, and in many cases it probably is the case, but that is not necessarily required. It just means that the parent and the child are not communicating in a way that makes the child feel secure. And sometimes the parents have no control over this. If the parent is stressed, the child will pick up on that and will also become stressed because their survival depends on the caregiver. I don't want to get too into this. I'm kind of going off now. I'm going to move on from this. My next video is going to be all about attachment, but I do want to make it very clear that just because a child is experiencing toxic stress does not necessarily mean that the parent is abusive or unloving, even though that can be the case. Alright, now before I talk about CRPS, I actually want to talk about autism and ADHD. Both of these are also biopsychosocial developmental disorders, and they're a bit more researched than CRPS is, just because more people are affected by it. So I want to talk about these a little bit. The Rich Club organization consists of 6 pairs on opposite sides of brain, of well-connected neural hubs that orchestrate and integrate all brain activity, facilitating information exchange and coordinating between brain areas. Now, I'm not going to get into what each of those areas do, but I am going to tell you what those areas are. The precuneus, superior frontal cortex, the superior parietal cortex, the hippocampus, the thalamus, and the putamen. Because these areas work in a network, if one region is negatively affected, all of them can be affected. This diagram to the right shows 3 different types of neural mapping. The top is autism, the middle is a neurotypical control, and the bottom is ADHD. In people with autism, they are creating far more close connections and less distant connections than neurotypical controls. In ADHD, they are creating fewer close neural projections and more distant connections than the neurotypical controls. Autism and ADHD share many symptoms. They are often co-diagnosed, and even though they work kind of in opposite directions, they may exist on a continuum of one overarching biopsychosocial developmental disorder, although that is hypothesis, not fact. So, notice the way that the different neural projections develop based on the way that a child responds to stress and their environment. It is CRPS contenders' personal hypothesis that CRPS, similar to autism spectrum disorder and ADHD, is a developmental disorder that revolves around dissociation and multiple types of functional lesions that occur when the framework of the brain is being developed in childhood, specifically in early childhood, and that the consequences of that behavior resulting in CRPS don't happen until later in life, but that the actual cause of it happens in childhood. I think that this causes dissociation and multiple types of functional lesions of the individual. I think there is a lesion in the body, in the gut-brain connection, causing dissociation and detachment from sensory input, physiological states, and the awareness of the condition of the body. I think it causes an inability to recognize stressors and stress responses when you're having them. Not necessarily that you don't know that you're stressed, because it might make you feel alive and ready to do things, and that's when you feel good. But you might not realize that you are stressed, even though that is the state you are chasing to make you feel anything. An inability to recognize gut feelings and the function of the enteric system, which sends a lot of information to the brain. The enteric system and the brain should be in a constant two-way dialogue, and I think that that gets cut off, and so there's only a one-way connection. I think there are functional lesions in the mind between the limbic system and the neocortex channels, creating a lack of communication between the emotional and analytical minds, causing severe difficulty feeling and recognizing emotional states, leading to rejection and suppression of any emotion, event, impact, or action that is considered unacceptable for whatever reason. And finally, I think there is a functional lesion in spirit between the conscious and the unconscious self, a self-esteem versus self-worth issue, where self-value is found in the opinions of others and not from within. This causes an over-attachment to a fragile, rigid ego for protection against pain experienced in the past, and that there are likely often many maladaptive ego stories and nasty mental chatter going on in the mental landscape of the person with CRPS, creating severe psychological self-abuse. I will discuss these concepts more and round them out further in following videos in this series. But a quick recap here of what we have discussed in this video. That CRPS is an immunoneurological disorder, what the connectome is and how neural networks operate, the importance of childhood neural development, functional lesions of the psyche in other biopsychosocial developmental disorders, including autism, ADHD, and moving into CRPS. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to contribute to my medical expenses, my Patreon is CRPS Contender. If you like the content I'm producing here, subscribe, hit that like button. You're welcome to share any videos on this channel. As always, relevant sources will be linked in the description below. You might check out my channel homepage to make sure that there's any videos that you haven't seen. It's because you're not interested and not because you don't know that they're there. Okay, I think that's everything I wanted to discuss in this video. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you next time.